Dwayne, could you tell us a little bit about your theory generally and what it's all about? And then we can go into detail about exactly some of the things in your theory later on.
You bet. Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm just a student of the Book of Mormon and have been for quite some time. I don't feel that I'm any authority by any means, and this is just a theory. It's there's a lot of little coincidences that have come about that make it very interesting, and I would hope that this is going to be something that may help prove the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, and that it'd be something that would be approved of sort of by our Father in heaven. And the way it all came about was that in my reading of the Book of Mormon, I've read it pretty much continually for about 15 years. And as I read the Book of Mormon, I've had an awful lot of outdoor experiences. I like the outdoors, and it seems to me like it indicates that the River Sidon, the headwaters start in the north and flow to the south and empty into the sea. And as I read that time and time again, I tried to visualize in my mind where the River Sidon would have been located in the Americas. And to the best of my knowledge, the River Sidon, or there is no large river from any of the American countries that starts in the north and flows to the south. There's none in South America or Mexico. There is only one place that I can find where the major river in the country starts in the north and flows to the south, and that's in the United States, where it starts up here in the Great Lakes area and flows on down and empties out in the Gulf of Mexico. And so as I read, I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and play like that is the River Sidon and see if it fits. And so I also came up with the idea that I'm also kind of a nut on records. And so I decided I would go through my Book of Mormon and mark the different locations in the book that had to do with any land identification information. And so I went through and I marked my book. I used different color pens. And I marked my book with a bright yellow that would have any information that was directly passed on from God or the Savior. And then I had a pink color here that was quotes of interest that I wanted to remember and bring out. And then I had an orange one that I used for records, and then a green one that I used for marking anything that I had that would had anything to do with land identification. And so I've gone through the Book of Mormon many times in marking it that way. And then I started going through and trying to identify where these things were taking place, if it were on the American continent here, the United States. And in the process, while I was doing that, I just, for some reason, happened to have a world book available there on my desk, and for the heck of it, I just looked up a name in the World Book, a city name, or a name in the Book of Mormon. The name I happened to look up was Ramha. I don't know if you can see over here, but I looked it up in the World Book. I written the city of Ramha, or the hill Ramha and the hill Cumorah over here in the New York area on my map. And I'd written a few things that I just guessed at. And then I went ahead and I looked that name up in the book, and I was just really surprised that when I looked it up in here, there was a Ramha. And it was a city, Ramha. And it was up north of the United States. And I was surprised that it was even in this part of the world. And so because I had looked that up, I thought, well, gee, I'll look up some more. So I went through the Book of Mormon, and I located the first name of a city in the Book of Mormon. And it so happens the name was Angola. And so I went ahead and looked in the World Book here for Angola, and there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Angolas in the book. And I was really surprised because one of them was in Indiana, one of them was Kansas, one of them was New York, one of them was a swamp in North Carolina, and the other one was in Africa, which I was familiar with. And so I proceeded to go ahead and locate those on the map where they belonged. And here's one right here, the city of Angola. It's a modern-day city of Angola right there in between these two bodies of water. And then there are, here's another city of Angola here. It's the present-day city of Angola. And over in North Carolina is where the swamp is. But anyway, I was really surprised and excited about that. And so I looked up the next name, and the next name was Boaz, city of Boaz. So I looked up Boaz in the World Book, and I found that there was 2 Boazes in the entire world. One of them was in Alabama, right here. And the other Boaz was in Wisconsin, right here. Modern-day cities of Boaz. None of them in South America, Mexico, over in the old country. And so I continued to do that. And this is a few of the names that I looked up. I even found that there is 2 Ephraims. There's an Ephraim naturally in Utah, but there's another Ephraim right here, the city of Ephraim. I found that there is cities of Sidon. When I looked that up, I found that there's 3 places in the world where the word Sidon is used. One of them is in Arkansas, and one of them is in Mississippi, and one of them is in Lebanon. And so, and I found that the 2 cities of Sidon that are here in the Americas, in the United States, are on either side of the Mississippi River. Modern day cities called Sidon right now. And I thought that was interesting. And then finally it ends up that in our Sunday school classes, as we studied the Doctrine and Covenants, in the new manual, I opened it up, and right in there it showed the Mississippi River, and it showed Nauvoo, and it also, opposite Nauvoo, it showed Zarahemla. And then I found out that in the Doctrine and Covenants, I don't have my Doctrine and Covenants here, but in the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith was instructed to name a city opposite of Nauvoo in the state of Iowa. He was supposed to name another city and develop another city called Zarahemla. And I thought, gee whiz, why would the Lord want to have 2 Zarahemlas? One in South or Central America, and one right here in the United States on the Mississippi River. And so I just thought, well, I'll just play like that is the city of Zarahemla in the Book of Mormon. So then I proceeded to read and follow through and mark my book, and I found out that the city of Zarahemla is on the west bank of the River Sidon. And I thought that was really interesting because the city here, Zarahemla, is on the west bank of the Mississippi. So then I went ahead and I thought, well, I'll just really be risky here. I'll just go ahead and map out some things just for fun and see what happens. And so I realized in the Book of Mormon that north of the city of Zarahemla and the land of Zarahemla was the land of Bountiful, and that it was nearly surrounded by water, and that north of that was the land of Desolation. And so I played like Desolation was up here in Canada, and that Bountiful was here. I believe this is Michigan. In between Bountiful and the land of Zarahemla was a wilderness, and it indicates in reading that the wilderness come clear across this narrow neck of land, and it went around and up the coast. Well, if there was a wilderness and it went across the land, it would be difficult for it to go up and up the coast on the other side. Anyway, so I put that wilderness in there just to play with it and see what happened. And then I read further and learned a little more about Desolation and how there was a narrow neck that separated the land Bountiful and the land Desolation, and the distance was about, it took a day and a half for a Lamanite to cross that area. This area here is about 60 miles across. Anyway, in this process, I wondered what the people in the Book of Mormon, what they would call these large bodies of water. And so I looked up on a world book to see what the seas that they were familiar with, what size they were in their country. And I looked at the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea and so on, and they're very, very tiny as compared to these bodies of water. And so I thought, well, maybe they were calling these seas. And that may fit really well because they talk about the sea east, the sea west, the sea north, and so on. And so I played like these were the seas that they were talking about. And I kind of entwined that in their movements, and they seemed to fit really well. And so I went ahead and it seemed quite confusing to try to look at the whole Book of Mormon as a whole, and try to figure out where these things were taking place, these movements, and where these land masses were and the cities were. So I thought, well, the easiest way for me to do that would be probably to take one individual's life and try to build the cities around their life. And so I went ahead and I thought I would start with Mormon. So I went ahead and duplicated the Great Lakes from this, put it on this, and then I started out in his lifetime. And I started out, and the first information was on page 468 in the Book of Mormon. It was the year 322 AD. And Amram hides the records that he has in charge of him in the hill Shem, S-H-I-M, in the land of Antum. And I think that's kind of important, and as we go on, you'll see maybe that has an important tie-in. The next thing is in 468, page 468, the year 322, Mormon, at 11 years old, is carried by his father into the land southward, even to the land of Zarahemla. So evidently he was in a land that was north, and he came down into this land, wherever that was, and the land was Zarahemla, not the city Zarahemla, but the land of Zarahemla. But he was brought from the north. The next thing here is that in 322 also, war begins in the borders of Zarahemla by the waters of Sidon. So there's wars that are in Zarahemla, either the city or the land, but they're by the headwaters of the river Sidon. And so this is the area of the headwaters of Sidon. And so that kind of fit in. The next thing happens is that says that the Nephites retreat towards the north countries and take possession of the city of Angola. So evidently the Lamanites are coming against this area, wherever Zarahemla is, and they're pushing the people out of Zarahemla into the north country, and they take possession of the city of Angola. Okay? Well, if they were to leave this area and head north, and I would think that possibly the reason they would go this direction is because it's surrounded by water, and they were outnumbered, and they could have a better control of defending themselves. And it just so happens, it's kind of funny, but if you were to leave this area and head this direction, there is already a present-day city, Angola, there. And I thought that was really interesting. As a matter of fact, somewhere in this study here, I thought, well, I'm going to call the different states and try to find out where those names originated. And so in the process, I was going through my maps. I'd gone through some detailed maps here. I went and got some more detailed maps that shows more cities and things like this. And I even got a magnifying glass, and I was going through here, looking around, trying to locate the hill Cumorah in this area. And as I was doing so, I noticed a lake right here in New York. I don't know if you can see that, but I looked at that with my magnifying glass. I just had to get close, and the name of that lake is Oneida. And that excited me because I knew there was some Oneidas in the Book of Mormon. So I looked up in the Book of Mormon Oneida, and I found that there was a hill Oneida, and then I also found that there was a city Oneida. and that that city had been destroyed during the time when the Savior was crucified. And it indicates that the way it was destroyed is that it was sunk, and that water came up in place thereof. And that really spurred me on to find out about the name Oneida. So I called the Historical Society in New York and asked the people there where that name originated, the name Oneida. And they told me that it was an old Indian name, that it was, in essence, it was a name that was used prior to the time that the whites had come here. And so that really excited me. And so then I went ahead and I called also and I asked about Angola, the city of Angola, where it got its name. They weren't sure, but that it was a very old name and that it had been used by the Indians. And one person says, well, it may have come from Africa, Angola, and how I called the Historical Society, and they had indicated that they weren't positive that the name had come from Africa, but that it was also an old Indian name. And then I started looking at other names. It ends up, I looked up the waters, I looked up Sebus in the World Book. And in looking up the name Sebus, I found that there was a place, there was 3 places listed. One in Maine, a river in Maine, and another lake in Maine. There was 3. There was a Sebus, Maine, a river, a Sebus in Maine, and a lake Sebus in Maine. And they were spelled a little differently, but sound about the same when you pronounce them. And so up here in Maine, there is a river Sebus, a lake, and a city named it. So I called the Maine Historical Society to ask them about it, and they indicated that those were old Indian names. I looked further and I found out that there are several cities of Jerusalem in the World Book. There's one in Israel, one in Arkansas, one in Jordan, one in Ohio. There's only 4 of them listed in the world. I called and talked to them. I talked to the one in Ohio. The lady I talked to said that the name was an old Indian name prior to the time that Columbus came. I wondered why Indians would be using the name Jerusalem before Columbus had ever came here to the United States. Anyway, I went on, and as I was looking with my magnifying glass at the different places, I noticed also that in this area here, I saw a name called Onondagas. And it's the Onondagas Indian Reservation right here. And it's in New York area. And I had remembered that name. And where that name came from was in the history of the church. And it's in regards to some travels that Joseph Smith was taking. And it tells about him traveling, and as they were going along, I'll read this to you. During our travels, we visited several of the mounds which had been thrown up by the ancient inhabitants of this country, Nephites, Lamanites, etc. And this morning I went up on a high mound near a river, accompanied by the brethren. From this mound we could overlook the tops of the trees and view the prairie on each side of the river as far as our vision could extend, and the scenery was truly delightful. On top of the mound were stones which presented the appearance of 3 altars having been erected one above the other, according to the ancient order. And the remains of bones were strewn over the surface of the ground. The brethren procured a shovel and a hoe, and removing the earth to the depth of about 1 foot, discovered the skeleton of a man, almost entire, and between his ribs the stone point of a Lamanitish arrow, which evidently produced his death. Elder Burr Riggs retained the arrow. The contemplation of the scenery around us produced particular sensations in our bosoms, and subsequently the vision of the past being opened to my understanding by the Spirit of the Almighty. I discovered that the person whose skeleton was before us was a white Lamanite, a large, thick-set man, and a man of God. His name was Zelph, he was a warrior and a chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, who was known from the hill Cumorah, or eastern sea, to the Rocky Mountains. The curse was taken from Zelph, or at least in part. One of his thigh bones was broken by a stone flung from a sling while in battle years before his death. He was killed in battle by the arrow found among his ribs during the last great struggle of the Lamanites and the Nephites. Now I thought there's several things very interesting in this. One thing is that he was a Lamanite that had become evidently a member of the church, and that his name was Zelph, and that he was under the great prophet Onondagas. Now here's that name Onondagas. Here's the Onondagas Indian Reservation right here, and they still are using that name today. And the next thing is that this prophet Onondagas was known from the hill Cumorah, which is right here, and it says, or the eastern sea. This is the eastern sea of the Great Lakes, to the Rocky Mountains, clear out to here. And another thing it indicates is that this fellow Zelph was killed during the last great struggle of the Lamanites and the Nephites. And that's in this general area, where that struggle and the last battle evidently took place, according to this, at least to my understanding. Now, as I went on and continued to mark these places, I'd like to go through it and read you just one little spot here in the Book of Mormon and see if you can see if this might fit. This is in Alma, 22nd chapter, starting with the 27th verse. It says, and it came to pass that the king sent a proclamation throughout all the land, amongst all his people, who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about. This is, anyway, let me go ahead here. Which was bordering even to the sea on the east. Now, if that fit here, this would be probably the eastern sea. And on the west, and which was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness. So if this were the sea east, and this was, or the west, and this is the sea east, then it was divided by this wilderness. Divided from the land of Zarahemla by the narrow strip of wilderness, Zarahemla being down below, which ran from the sea east even to the sea west, coming from the east to the west, and round about on the borders of the seashore. And round about on the borders of the seashore. I don't know how that could work down in Panama or in that area, but it kind of works there. Let's see, even to the, ran from the sea east to the sea west, and around about on the borders of the seashore and the borders of the wilderness, which was on the north of the land of Zarahemla. So this ran up, this is the north of the land of Zarahemla, through the borders of Manti, which Manti must be in this area, and I put Manti here, by the head of the river Sidon, which is the headwaters of the river Sidon, of the Mississippi River, running from the east towards the west, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. Now the more idle part of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness and dwelt in tents, and there were spread throughout the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi. So they were west in the land of Nephi. And why did it have the name Nephi? Is because it was the land that they always named their land after their leader. So Nephi was their leader. Initially, when they first landed, the first land would have been called Lehi. And then when Nephi and his people left his brothers, then they established a land which is called Nephi. So then that's why the Lamanites were over in the land of Nephi, because the Nephites had been driven out. And so anyway, I'll go on. in the place of their father's first inheritance, and thus bordering along by the seashore. So evidently they are referring to this land that is west of them as the land of Nephi, clear over to the point of their first inheritance. And this was all Lamanite country. And so it goes on. And thus bordering on by the seashore. And also there were many Lamanites on the east by the seashore, where the Nephites had driven them. So I would think that there's even Nephites here, where the Nephites had driven them. And thus the Nephites were nearly surrounded by the Lamanites. So the Lamanites were on this side and on this side. And so this is the area of the Nephite people. Okay. Nevertheless, the Nephites had taken possession of all of the land, all of the northern parts of the land bordering on the wilderness, at the head of the river Sidon, from the east to the west, around about on the wilderness side, on the north even until they came to the land called Bountiful. On the north even until they came up to the land called Bountiful. And it bordered upon the land which was called Desolation, it being so far northward that it came into the land which had been peopled and been destroyed, of whose bones we have spoken, which was discovered by the people of Zarahemla, it being the place of their first landing. So the land of Bountiful was north of the land of Zarahemla, and it bordered on the land of Desolation, which happened to be the same place where the Jaredite people had previously lived, and it being the place of their inheritance. So, and it so happens I was up in Toronto, which is in this area, not too long ago, when they discovered a huge burial right within the city area, where there was literally thousands of skeletons. And they couldn't figure out how come there had been such mass burials there. And but the professors and all that were there indicated that it was probably of the time approximately 2000 BC, which would fit in pretty closely with the Jaredite people. And if you recall, they called the land Desolation because the people that had lived there previously had destroyed all the timber. And in this area up here in the country, there is very little timber as compared to northward down into Michigan and that area. Anyway, so it goes on here. Let's see. And it came to pass from there up into the land southward, thus the land on the northward was called Desolation, and the land on the southward was called Bountiful, it being the wilderness which is filled with all manner of wild beasts, of animals of every kind, a part of which had come from the land northward for food. So this is the area that had been destroyed of trees, and this is where the animals took up their place of living, and that's where they claim that there's a lot of animals. And now it was only the distance of a day and a half's journey for a Nephite on the land, line Bountiful and the land Desolation, from the east to the west sea. So it was only a day and a half's journey in between these two lands. Thus the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land in between the land northward and the land southward. And it came to pass that the Nephites had inhabited the land Bountiful, even from the sea, from the east and to the west sea, and thus the Nephites, in their wisdom, with their guards and their armies, had hemmed in the Lamanites on the south. So the Lamanites are driving them up in this area, and they've hemmed them in and separated themselves from them. Okay, anyway, it says here, and it came to pass that the Nephites had inhabited the land Bountiful, even from the east into the west sea, and thus the Nephites in their wisdom, with their guards and their armies, had hemmed in the Lamanites on the south, that thereby they could have no more possession on the north, that they might not overrun the land northward. Therefore the Lamanites could have no more possessions, only in the land of Nephi and the wilderness round about. So from the way I read that, they have fortified themselves and protected this area against the Lamanites that are taking over. Let's go back once again to this map over here and the happenings that were taking place with Mormon. Let's go on here. It says that in the year 326 to 328 AD that the Nephites were also driven out of the land of David. I'm not located on the maps the land of David. The next happening, they marched forth and came to the land of Joshua, which was bordered on the West Sea. So I would believe that they were traveling this direction, and if that's the case, they were coming near the West Sea, and Joshua is in that area. The next happening over here on the map, year 345 AD, the Nephites again are driven to the land of Joshua. So they've been fighting back and forth through that 15-year period. And then the next happening, the city of Joshua is near the land where Amaron deposited the records in the hill Shem. And that goes back then. So now they're up in where Joshua is, up in here. And that Joshua is the area where the hill Shem is, where Amaron had deposited the records. The next thing is, if you go back to the very beginning when we started on this map, it says here Amaron hid the records in the hill Shem in the land of Antum. So Antum must be somewhere near that same area. And here is where Moroni was from, and that he was taken, where Mormon was from, and when he was 11 years old, he was brought down from the map here, down into the land of Zarahemla. So all those things were kind of taking place in the same general area. Now the next happening is that the Nephites are driven north to the land which was called Shem, and in the Book of Mormon it's spelled with an E instead of an I. And I'm not sure whether there's a city called Shem there, or whether the misspelling has happened, or just what, but the sound is the same. The next thing is that there's a treaty made. The Nephites' land is north of the narrow passage, and the Lamanites is south of the narrow passage. I'm not sure whether it is this narrow passage or this narrow passage. I almost believe that they have been driven out of here now, or being driven out of here, and are retreated into this area. But we'll go on. The next thing is that the Lamanites come down to the city of desolation to battle. Now, I believe that the way that took place over here is that the Lamanites had come in here and were stopped, and so the Lamanites had come around from the top, another army of the Lamanites, and came down into the land of desolation, and that the city of desolation must be in the top part of the land of desolation. And so they come down to battle against them. They're surrounding the Nephites. The next thing happens is that the Lamanites come down again, and the dead is cast into the sea. So they're near a sea. And so over there in this area, their battle is going back and forth in this area, and the dead is cast into the sea, one sea or the other. Back over here again, the Nephites swear to go up to battle. And so they're going to go up to battle against these people that are coming down. So the Nephites have sworn to go up after them. The next thing happens is that Mormon quits the army. In 473 AD, Mormon claims that they're too wicked and so on, and he goes against being their military leader. And at that time, they didn't care anyway. They had been winning some of their battles, and so it looked great. Over here then, the next happening is in 74, is in 363. The Nephites go up out of the land of desolation to battle. So they go up to battle against the Lamanites. The next happening, the Lamanites take possession of the city of desolation. They come down and take the city. The next one, the remainder of the Nephites flee and join the inhabitants of the city of Teancum. So now they're moving south, down from the city of desolation. The next happening, the Lamanites come against the city of Teancum and are driven back beyond the city of desolation. And Nephites retake the city of desolation. So the Nephites then have taken and pushed the Lamanites back beyond the city of desolation and back up into the north. The next thing over here is the Nephites lose the city of desolation and flee to the city of Boaz. The city is held until the Lamanites come the second time. And then finally the Nephites flee from town and villages. So now I would imagine that over here the Lamanites have finally pushed them and are pushing them down through this area, through the cities in this area. And they're fleeing from one city to the next. Mormon then, in this period of time, returns. He sees that the Lamanites were overthrowing the land and takes the records from the hill Shem, which Amram had deposited. So now Mormon goes over evidently and goes over to the hill Shem, takes those wagon loads of records, and one way or another works his way back over to the hill Cumorah area, where he puts them in the hill Cumorah. And at that time, I guess, is when he is compiling the record which he gives to his son Moroni, which is the Book of Mormon that we have. Mormon then again takes command of the armies, and the Nephites flee to the city of Jordan and hold the city. I don't know where it is, but evidently it's probably right there near that narrow neck. The next thing happens, other cities were also held when Mormon has come back. The next thing happens, Mormon writes an epistle and then gathers the people to the land of Cumorah, to a hill which was in the land of many rivers, waters, and fountains, and hoped to gain advantage. Mormon is now about 75 years old, and finally the battle is over and the dissenters flee southward. So what Mormon does over here, when he finally takes command, there's somewhere, I guess, in this area, he writes a letter to the head of the Lamanites and asks that he would have a period of time to regroup his people at the land of Cumorah, near the hill Cumorah. And I would imagine that, and he felt that because of the many waters, rivers, and fountains, and this entire area is covered with all these little finger lakes and so on, around by the hill Cumorah, he would have the leak area, I guess it is, this lake anyway, to back him up. He'd be able to have men across here to stop them, and they could hem themselves in there to try to protect them against the Lamanites. And that's what they did, I would guess. And the Lamanites came against them. They came this way, they came this way to fight against them. And the only survivors either joined with the Lamanites or fled into the south countries. And they were hunted and destroyed, it says. There was one other thing I did. I wanted to add in some things that were taking place in that same general area in the Book of Ether. And they talked in there of the land of Nehor, which I haven't identified. And then they talk of the land of Moran, which is near the land desolation. Moroni points out and kind of compares where these are in the Book of Ether. They talk about the hill Ephraim. Is this a Nephite name? I wasn't sure whether it was a Nephite name or whether it was a Jaredite name. But it's a hill with ore on it, and that's where they went and produced all their weapons. It's kind of a coincidence, because this is a city of Ephraim right here, a modern-day city of Ephraim. The only other one, the other one is in Utah. But this city of Ephraim happens to be right in the Iron Belt. And if you look over here to this map, here's where Ephraim is, and this whole area is the Iron Belt. All through here is the Iron Belt. As a matter of fact, right in here somewhere is a mountain that's called, right here, called Iron Mountain. And so it kind of fits in well with an area where there would be ore to produce weapons with. And then back over here, it says that they return to the city of Nehor. The next thing happens is they pass by the hill Shem, by where a place, the hill Shem, by a place where the Nephites were destroyed. Thence they went eastward to the sea Ablon, or to the eastward to Ablon by the seashore. So they passed by the same hill Shem that probably was the same hill over here that Amoron had hid the records in, and that Mormon went and gathered the records up from. But the Jaredites had come by there, and Moroni in the Book of Ether refers to that same land identification. And then it says here that the Jaredite people fled toward the land southward, which was called by the Nephites Zarahemla. So in this particular time, when they're having their war, they fled southward down into the land which the Nephites called Zarahemla. And so that kind of fits in the Jaredite record. And that most people know that this general area, I believe it's understood that this general area is the area where the Jaredite people landed. And I think most people agree with that. If that's the case, it fits in right well with the last battles in the Book of Mormon and the Nephite people. And then they built a great city by the narrow neck of land where the sea divides the land. I don't know really where that would be, but the Jaredite people evidently built a city somewhere where the sea divides the land. And there's a lot of places that would fit into. There was one more thing I wanted to talk about, and when you talk about the people traveling and during their wars and leaving from one land to another, or one place to another, one city to another, I did something with the use of the history of the church. I just plotted out the travels of the people. I started up here in Kirkland, Ohio, and reading this, I could tell how many miles they traveled in a day, and I tried to plot this on the map. You get that, Mike? And for example, this first day they left Kirkland and they went 27 miles. The next day they went 23 miles. They rested a day, it might have been Sunday, and then they went 12 miles. And then it starts back down here, these maps join here, and these are the, if you can see this, these are the distances that they traveled each day and the mileage. And so you can see how they traveled. They traveled all the way down here into to Kansas City, to Missouri, into this area. But you can see how they travel and how long it takes them to travel. And the interesting thing is that they were using the same mode of travel as the Book of Mormon people were using. So you could see it would be very comparable in time, traveling from one place to another. It would be very impossible for people to travel from this general area down to Central America and back and forth in the same amount of time that it had taken people to walk just a couple hundred miles. And so, anyway, I think this kind of fits. And my own feelings are that it's very possible that Nephi landed on this coast, and this was probably initially the land of Lehi, and they lived there until Lehi passed away. And then it says that Nephi left with all those that believed the way he did and took the records, and they went for a long distance, it indicates, into a land that was filled with all types of minerals and animals and so on. I doubt if there's a place that is more abundant in those things than right here in Utah. And then they established the land and they made him a king. And so I would say that was probably the area where the land of Nephi was established. Then they lived for quite some time and had their wars and so on, and then finally it ends up that they were destroyed down to a point where Mosiah left with a group of people, and he left and went down and talks about going down. This is all downhill. All this drainages, this water indicates it's this downhill. They went downhill and they ran into a group of people that were in the city of Zarahemla, named after their leader Zarahemla, and they were part of the Mulekite people, and they were living in the general area where they had landed. And they came down and joined together and made Mosiah their leader, and they lived there for quite some time. And then the Nephite people propagated and took over this area. And it ends up that they kept growing this way and taking over this area, and then finally it ends up that King Limhi, the people wanted to go back and establish actually in their land of their inheritance. They wanted to go back in the land of Nephi and establish that. And so that part of them did go back and establish that. But anyway, I feel that's that's possibly what has taken place. Anyway, I offer this as just merely as a theory. It's kind of fun, and if it does nothing more than spur you on to studying to disprove the theory or prove the theory, I think it would do everyone some good. If it has the potential of enhancing the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and helping people to understand it more, that would be my goal. I know that there's a very close similarity to the mound builders that they have been studying. The mound builders all lived down through the Mississippi Valley area, and they lived at two different periods of time. The more ancient ones, they claim, were a more, I guess, progressive and more civilized people. They claim that some of these mounds that they built back in this area were built which parallel the time of the Book of Mormon, and that some of those mounds that were created were so huge and so perfectly built that it would take top quality engineers of today to be able to try to duplicate them. They have found rock boxes, they have found rock burial vaults, and all kinds of things in this mound builder culture. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if those don't tie together very well with the Nephites and Lamanites, and I would like to work towards proving or disproving that. But anyway, I just offer this as a theory, and I appreciate you listening to it.
Okay.
Any questions, Mike?
Yeah. In the area where Utah is, I understand that was an area where the earthquakes and so on took place. Can you tell?
Well, I have some theories along that line, and they're just strictly theories. I feel that it's possible. You know, in the Book of Mormon, there are eyewitness accounts of the devastation that took place when the Savior was crucified. It also indicates that the more righteous were spared and the wicked were destroyed, and that evidently the greatest destruction took place then in the lands where the wicked people were. And I would think that if that were the case, that it also mentioned that there were mountains raised up. And I don't know of any modern day geological people that have indicated that there are mountains raised up around 34 BC, or AD, excuse me. And I don't know where those mountains are. But the youngest mountains I understand in our area are the Rocky Mountains here. And if by chance those Rocky Mountains were raised up, or in part by at the time that Jesus was crucified, then it would have changed this whole land. And towards the end of the Book of Mormon, as I was talking about, that this leader, what's his name? Anyway, this prophet Onondagas, he says that they said that Joe Smith said that he was known from the Rocky Mountains to the Eastern Sea. Well, the Rocky Mountains were there in the latter part. I don't know that there are indications that they were there prior to that time. But anyway, if in fact they were raised up, it would have been a perfect time to disrupt the whole waterways of that particular part of the land. And I think that it's very possible, if that were the case, that that's when the Lake Bonneville was created. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger until finally it overflowed and broke its bounds and finally then evaporated. It also could have been a time when the entire climate could have been changed because of this massive earthquake. I believe that Mount St. Helens and some of these other earthquakes have had an effect on our weather system today in the world. And I think that this was a much greater capacity than Mount St. Helens and those others that we've experienced. And so if that's the case, I know that during the Book of Mormon times, they don't talk about snow. Snow is only mentioned one time in the Old Country, but they never mention snow. They never mention death and devastation by bad winters or anything like that. And so I would have to think that probably during that time that there was a more milder climate, and that's one of the theories that I have. But let's see. Also, there's one other thought I had that during all this I had the opportunity of going down and visiting many of the ruins down in Central America, and it's really a real spiritual experience. And But after going through this, I had a thought that the thought was actually Christ doesn't build pyramids. And I know that the majority of those ruins down there were built with slave labor. I don't think the Lord would inspire any slave labor to create things for himself. And although there's massive, beautiful cities down there, there are also massive, beautiful cities in Rome, and I don't think the Lord inspired those either. And I'm not sure that there's a real tie-in with the religious people and the pyramids in Central America. And anyway, anything else?